Welcome back. We're here to talk again about Me Too, I guess Me Too Part 2 in the Hebrew Bible. In this case, we're going to be looking at the rest of the Hebrew Bible. Last time we focused primarily on the Torah, the first 5 books. But the Torah is just the first part of the 3-part Hebrew Bible. There's the Torah, which you'll see the scroll in the sanctuary, you read from it special events. There's a reading cycle where you look at a different portion, 54 portions over the course of a year. But then there's the rest of the Hebrew Bible. One section called the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and then a third section called the Ketuvim, or the writings. And some passages of that are actually read in conventional synagogue services. They're what's called the Haftorah, the additional reading that's read paired with the Torah reading on a similar theme or issue. But you don't read those other books systematically, generally. They're available as an important library of important books, but it's sort of like what Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain, called the classics. They're books that everyone wants to have read, but nobody wants to read. So in this case, the rest of the books of the Hebrew Bible are actually, some of them very interesting, but many of them don't get read.
But the part after the first 5 books, though, you still have a chunk that's sort of before you get to the prophets, right?
Yes. Even though it's called the prophets, the first part is more historical books. You've got Judges and Joshua.
Is that considered part of prophets?
It's in the prophets section.
Oh, okay.
The division is called prophets, even though it includes Joshua, Judges, King, Samuel, and Kings, which are more historical books than sort of prophetic declarations, like the real prophets books in the second half. But it's still nevertheless the name of the division. And look, the third division is called writings. How is that helpful? Yeah. They're all writings. So
some of them are songs.
Doesn't narrow it down, right? It's just like almost like miscellaneous. But we know that 3-part division goes back a long way because a Jewish scholar of the 2nd century BCE named Ben Sira, or Ben Sirach it sometimes appears, or Ecclesiasticus is another way of his writing is titled. He refers to the 3 parts of the Revelation as the Torah, the prophets, and the other writings. So even 200 BCE, we don't know what was in the other writings necessarily, but we know that there was that 3-part division. In any case, we're going to be focusing on the second 2 parts, the prophets part and the other writings part, understanding that some of the pieces are not read very often, and some are actually read every year because, for example, the 5 scrolls, which appear near the end of the writings, are assigned to specific holidays. You read the scroll of Esther on Purim. You read the scroll of Song of Songs on Passover. You read the scroll of Ruth on Shavuot. You read the scroll of Ecclesiastes during Sukkot. So some are assigned to specific holidays, and then you do read them. But there are others that simply are not focused on that often. So some of these stories will be familiar to those with a traditional Jewish education. Some of these will be rather new. Before we start, though, I just wanted to do a quick recap on what Me Too is and where it comes from. As you recall from last time, Me Too was started by a woman named Tarana Burke in 2006. She had actually been working with other survivors of sexual assault and came up with this concept of empowerment through empathy. That if women could share their own experience with other women, to say this happened to me too, it would enable both of them to heal in some way, but also to commiserate and to work together to make this less common of an experience going forward. One hopes that girls growing up today will have far fewer experiences that would qualify in the Me Too category than women growing up 30, 40 years ago. Now the movement really took off when the actress Alyssa Milano promoted it. In 2017, it led to the fall of Harvey Weinstein and a number of other famous people who were busted for behavior they should have been busted for a long time ago. But it made people more aware of the issue. And the premise, as described, I think this is by Burke. If all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. Now, what we're doing is backdating it. We're applying this concept to pre-feminist writings. I mean, part of what was shocking about the Me Too moment for some people, I will say probably mostly men, was the fact that this stuff was still going on. You know, we would have thought that at some point between the 1970s and now, this would have been, and before 2017, this would have been beyond the pale. But it wasn't, unfortunately, all too often. But if you go back in time, you can imagine it's going to be worse and worse and worse in this respect. In terms of how women are treated, whether they're given a sense of autonomy and dignity or agency, able to decide for themselves, a world of arranged marriages, a world of girls being the property of their father and then becoming the property of their husbands. These are the settings for women's disempowerment. So in some ways, if you see Me Too as an empowerment movement for women, the opposite of it would be disempowerment of women. Bodily autonomy for sure, but also more broadly considered. All right, so that's a quick background on it. So we're going to take a look at perhaps the most famous of these stories. We're going to look at 5 stories if we have the time for it. But this first one is the most famous. It's the story of Esther. It's famous in Jewish life because little girls dress up as Esther for Purim every year. That's part of the fun. You dress up in the carnival, and the boys are Mordechai, or the boys are Haman, or the boys, are the king Achashverosh. And the girls nowadays have 2 choices. Historically, they had one. They were Esther. Nowadays, some girls decide to dress as Vashti, who is the initial queen married to King Achashverosh, and we'll see why in the first part of the story. The king is having a multi-day feast. We pick up the story here. Vashti, the queen, is also making a feast for women. And on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded that the 7 eunuchs who served in his presence should bring Vashti, the queen, before the king wearing the royal crown, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was beautiful. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by the eunuchs, and the king was mad. Now, we talked last time about how rabbinic interpretation sometimes shifts the meaning of the story or adds color or context. In this case, they imagine that because he says, show up wearing your crown, the implication is, show up wearing only your crown. In other words, naked.
That's the way they read it.
In other words, naked, to show off her beauty. And then they imagine that she had oppressed the Jews by taking Jewish women and making them work for her naked. So therefore she was getting punished in the same way that she had sinned by embarrassing these Jewish women. So now she has to go.
They totally made that up.
Well, there's nothing there necessarily, and one wonders about the rabbis imagining the scene,
yeah.
all these
Where's
Jewish
his
women
brain?
working naked.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in any case.
What's going on there?
In any case, the reason why Vashti has become a heroine now is that she refused to come at the king. She pushed back. She said no. It's an interesting circumstance that one of the first church-state separation cases that was argued through to the Supreme Court in the 1950s in Illinois, starting in Illinois, was by a woman whose name was Vashti McCullum. Just interesting side connection, who also pushed back on the conventional authority. In any case, the point here is Vashti says no, so now the wise men and the king have to decide, what shall we do to Queen Vashti? Because she did not do the bidding of King Achashverosh by the eunuchs. Now I shouldn't have to point out, why do you have eunuchs that serve with the women?
So
Well,
that they
yeah.
can
No chance for hanky-panky, right? Or at least not any
Well,
kind
I was
that,
going to say there'd be hanky-panky.
There could be
but it doesn't
hanky-panky, but
end up with any
not any kind that imperils the bloodline.
Right.
And parentage. We talked about the importance of, assuring parentage for a man. So one of the advisors to the king says, Vashti has done wrong not only to the king, but to all the princes and all the people. For this deed of the queen will become known to all women, causing them to show contempt for their husbands when it is reported Vashti the queen to be brought before him and she didn't come. Today the princesses of Persia and Media who have heard the queen's deed will tell the king's princes. This will cause contempt and wrath. And so a royal commandment should go forth that says Vashti shall never again come before King Achashverosh and give away her royal estate to anyone. When the king's decree will be made published throughout the kingdom, all the wives will give their husbands honor, both great and small. So what was Vashti's sin?
She said no.
She said no. What's
She
another
didn't want to
aspect?
be paraded around naked in front of her husband's friends.
All right, she asserted her dignity and some bodily autonomy, right, to control before whom she chooses to be naked.
Mhm.
Any other transgressions?
Well, it says the law says that she has to do what the king says, so she broke the law.
She broke the law and she disobeyed her husband.
Right.
Notice the lesson they want to teach all the wives of the kingdom at the end is to honor your husband, no matter whether you're famous and the queen or, you know, ordinary person. The wives should honor their husbands. Now, this story is a bit of a farce. That was captured on video, by the way. Just so the wives, you know, are expected to honor their husbands. But this story, on some level, is a farce, right? And it comes out in a lot of aspects of the story. The number of people killed at the end, and you know, it's not meant to be literal history. So one wonders: is this sort of mocking the Persians that they're dumb enough to think this will actually work, or is it asserting a positive value that this is the way things should be? You know, we'll never really know, but you could read it plausibly both ways. But in any case, the value is presented that obeying the husband is important, and one of the ways that Esther succeeds as a queen in the court of Ahasuerus is she does obey the king's rules to the nth degree. That happens a little bit later in the book.
But I thought women couldn't own property.
Well, evidently the queen had some estates that she had control over. You know, that rule of women not owning property applies differently in different places. Remember, this is in Persia. This is not under the Hebrews. Also, in certain circumstances, women could own property. A daughter could inherit from her father if there were no sons, is one example. Married woman, less clear. But again, this is set in Persia. And again, it's set in sort of a fairy tale fantasy kind of an era. I mean, I'll give you just one example of how this is not plausible. The Persian Empire would never choose a queen for the king based on a beauty contest. And we'll see this is no beauty contest. There wouldn't be like a talent search going out to the countryside to find all the pretty girls. No, it's based on pedigree.
Right.
You know, royal houses are almost always based on pedigree.
And alliances with other royal
or political alliances with other. Choosing a random pretty girl, like that doesn't make any sense.
No.
That would never happen that way. But this is set in this sort of fantasy world where a Jewish girl could actually make it all the way to the big time, and that's, you know, so you have to accept with a grain of salt the narrative being given here.
There's also, just as a by the by, I'm an African historian, in a lot of African societies, whereas regular women wouldn't be owning property, the queen and the queen mother are very often sort of separate entities in the royals, and they do own properties, and they are treated to some degree like a king within their own sphere. So that's a very specific thing. But,
Yeah,
it's
that would
not
make
at all
sense here.
unusual for that to happen like that.
Yeah. Okay, so now the king got rid of Vashti, and he sobers up, and now he needs a new queen.
Sobers up.
So the king's servants suggest, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. He'll appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom. It's like talent search, right? Yeah. Gather together all the beautiful young virgins to the citadel of Susa, to the women's house. Give them over to the custody of the eunuch, right? Keeper of the woman. Let them be given cosmetics, and the maiden who pleases the king will be queen instead of Vashti. This idea pleased the king. Hey, sounds good to me. So,
Let it be so.
they send out all the messengers. They collect all the beautiful young virgins. Again, why virgins? Why would you buy a used car? You want a new car. And so, when the commandment was given, Esther, who's been described in the intervening passage as one of the exiles from Judah that has made it to the east under the Persian Empire, she's taken into the king's house, and she is very successful there. She obtains kindness from the keeper of the woman. He gives her cosmetics and portions of food and 7 maidens to help her. She had not let anyone know of her people, and Mordecai told her not to tell anyone, so she's a secret Jew. Again, the rabbis intervene here with their creative imagination, because after all, what is she allowed to eat in this household? If she follows all the rabbinic dietary laws, which of course she must if the rabbis are envisioning, a pious Jewish girl in the story. Well, they imagine she survived on nuts, which are very hard to make top kosher. They're in a shell, so you could solve it that way. And again, they imagine all kinds of convoluted ways that she manages to keep Shabbat and whatever, just to show what a wonderful pious girl that she was. But as we'll see, the way she wins the contest is not about her beauty, contrary to what many Sunday schools will teach you when they imagine it as a beauty contest, because the real story in this version is problematic. So, how does the audition happen? Each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after her purification for 12 months, 6 months with myrrh and 6 months with sweet fragrances. Why 12 months?
Make sure she's in her.
That's right. Make double sure, virgin, and also, just in case she faked that, not pregnant. The young woman came to the king like this. Whatever she desired was given to her to go with her out of the woman's house to the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the next day she returned to the second woman's house, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. And she came into the king no more, unless the king delighted in her. So again, here's the scene. Sundown on day one. She goes to the king's house from the first woman's house. Sun comes up the next morning. She goes to a different woman's house, the house of the concubines. What happened overnight? The audition. This is no beauty contest.
No, obviously.
They don't care if she can juggle flaming torches, right? That's not what she's doing with the king. This is, that legendary idea of the jus prima noctis, that the Lord has the right to have the first night with the engaged woman. This is the king exerting his sexual authority over all these virgins, and then they become available to him in the concubine's house until he makes a final decision, and then he can throw them out, and it doesn't matter. He doesn't care. As Mel Brooks said, it's good to be the king. So in this case, for Ahasuerus, it certainly is. So Esther is taken to King Ahasuerus in the 10th month, the month of Tevet. He loved Esther more than all the women. She obtained favor and kindness in his sight more than all the virgins. So he put the crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. How did she do this? We do not know.
She was good in bed.
Really good in bed.
Clearly.
She did what was needed. She won the contest, whatever.
However, good job.
Somebody gave her some good tutoring.
Yes, well, whatever. In any case, you can see why this is not really a story for children.
Not told like this, anyway.
Not told like this, right? But you can also see how this exemplifies a world where women are objects.
Oh, yeah.
Women have no control over what happens to them. If they can be taken, even if it's legendary, if they can be taken captive by a king and then used in this way, and what about all the other women who didn't win the contest? Fine, Esther wins.
They're stuck in the second house.
Yeah, how many?
Well, I was just going to say, and she doesn't have pure anymore.
Right. Right. How many?
People had lots of concubines.
Well, but
Yeah, but that's respecting.
That doesn't mean he
These
kept-
women have no other choice.
it doesn't mean that he kept them. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't.
But how many women did he go through before he settled on Esther? We don't know. But there's all the non-Esters in this story too. So now, fast forward a bit, since we're not really reviewing the full story. Esther manages to go to the king, following all the rules of obsequiousness, bowing several times and whatever. And she manages to invite the king to a banquet at her home with Haman. And so on the second night of this banquet, the king asks Esther, what do you want? I'll give you even half the kingdom, whatever you want. And so she says to the king, save me my life and my people. We are sold by people to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. Even if you'd sold us as slaves, I would have been silent. But this would have been a problem for you. You would have lost our value. The king says to Esther, who is the person, where is he who dared presume to do this? This adversary and enemy Haman has sold the Jews to be killed. Now, in earlier chapters, he bribed the king to get permission to enact this decree under the king's name to wipe out all the Jews, and he rolled dice to decide the date. The word for dice is pur, which is where we get the word Purim, from the dice that were rolled to choose the date. But in any case, this is the part of the story we know, and we think, oh, Haman is going to be destroyed because he wants to kill all the Jews, and Esther's a Jew, and the king has sympathy. So this is also maybe a positive argument for intermarriage, because the more Jews are married to non-Jews, the non-Jews will have sympathy for Jewish people, and then, we'll be protected. So this is the sort of surface reading of the story. But Haman's real crime is not wanting to kill the Jews, because after all, the king signed off on Haman's petition to do that in the first place. Didn't have a problem with it. But when Haman is accused by Esther, he's afraid before the king and queen. The king arose in his wrath from the banquet and went into the palace garden. Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen. He saw there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the palace for the banquet of wine, and Haman had fallen on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in front of me in the house?" So what's Haman's sin?
Rape.
Haman's sin is thought to be having attempted to rape Esther. Now, did he? According to the story, he had just fallen on the couch to beg her forgiveness. But the king, seeing Haman on the couch with his wife, connected the dots and decided, he's done. Gone. And so they hang Haman on the gallows he'd prepared for Mordecai. And the king's wrath was pacified. Of course, there's still this royal decree that he issued that was going to kill all the Jews, but and they have to resolve that in a different way. He actually gives the Jews permission to fight back, because for some reason he can't cancel his own decree,
that
which
was a weird thing.
also doesn't make a lot of
Unless
sense.
he makes the law, he can't change it. That
Right.
seemed very strange, yeah.
In many ways, the book of Esther is like a Jewish diaspora wish fulfillment story, where we get to marry up, and then they protect us, and then they let us fight back, and we kill all the people that hate us, and then people are afraid of us, so they pretend to be Jewish. What happens at one point in the story, and so we win and they lose. Yay! So it's a fantasy story in that way. But the point we're looking at today is the role of Esther in this story, as doing her best within a difficult system. We'll see that theme come up again. But the violations that are done to her by the king first, and then even threatened by Haman in this moment, or even her defense by the king, doesn't necessarily give her agency. He doesn't assume that she's pushing back or that she has any ability to resist, because if Haman's on the couch, then something bad must be happening, and Haman's deserves whatever happens to him. Not that I have a lot of sympathy for
He
Haman.
also didn't blame her.
He didn't blame her, that's true.
No, which very often they do. I mean,
Right.
yeah, I mean,
If she'd been a normal person and married somebody else, they would have stoned her.
well,
We saw that live.
But this is Persia, so the
Yes.
rules aren't necessarily the same.
In any case, the point is made that she's not a full person in many ways, and the treatment of her sexuality is as the
Was
property
there
of
any indication that she did this on purpose?
what got him to fall on the couch? Unknown. So now we're going to look at some other stories, less known stories, but in some cases even more appalling because of the way women are treated and not respected. This is one from Judges chapter 19, and you'll see some features similar to the stories in Sodom and Gomorrah that take place in Genesis that we didn't look at last time. The premise of this story is there's a Levite. Remember, this is a tribe that doesn't have its own territory, so there are Levites scattered around in many settlements. Living on the farther side of the hill country of Ephraim, he took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine played the prostitute against him and went away from him to her father's house in Bethlehem, Judah, and was there for 4 months. So the premise is he's taken a woman to provide for his sexual needs, but hasn't married her. She decides to leave him. They assume she's being, whoring around because she's not with the man who is her owner, so to speak. I went back to her father's house in Bethlehem. So her husband arose, the problem is the word husband here really is her man arose, because or her owner, you see.
It's the man who she was a concubine to.
Yes,
Right.
But in English we say husband and it has a sense of marriage. In Hebrew, historically the term for husband was Baal, which means master or owner. And so the husband was the Baal, the woman was the Isha, his woman. So when it says her husband, it's either saying her man or her Baal or her master, her owner. So translating it as husband provides a legal veneer. in English that you don't really have in the original Hebrew. So her man, or her owner, arose, went after her to speak kindly to her, to bring her again, sending his servants with a couple of donkeys. And so he then stayed with them for a couple of days. On his way back, the father sent them off. They go to another town called Jabesh Gilead. And an old man welcomes them in. He feeds them, washes their feet, and so on. And as they were making their hearts merry, the men of the city, certain wicked fellows, surrounded the house, began beating on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who came into your house so that we can have sex with him."
With the man?
Yes.
There's no gay stuff in the Bible, though.
No.
Not
Well, but this is all evil, right? When they do that in Sodom and Gomorrah, that's why it's called sodomy, because
Right.
it's evil, it's bad, you don't do this. But of course, the violation here is not just the gay sex, it's the lack of hospitality, it's the disrespect to the guest, it's the violation of the man's dignity. So notice what the old man who owns the house responds. "My brothers, please don't act so wickedly. This man has come into my house. Don't do this folly. Behold, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out now. Humble them and do with them what seems good to you, but to the man don't do any such folly." The same thing happens in Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot, who is Abraham's nephew, offers his virgin daughters to the mob to protect his visiting male guests. The same dynamic. Again, the women are fungible, they are property. Even his own daughter, compared to this stranger who's shown up. The men wouldn't listen to him. So the traveling man grabbed his concubine and brought her out to them. And they had sex with her and abused her all night until the morning. When the day began to dawn, they let her go. Then the woman came in the dawning of the day and fell down at the door of the man's house where her lord was until it was light. Her lord rose up in the morning, opened the doors of the house, and went out to go on his way. Behold, the woman, his concubine, had fallen down at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. I mean, the drama of that, right? You can picture the hands there. She's been abused all night, all this suffering. He said to her, "Get up and let's get going." But no one answered. She's died. She's been raped to death overnight to protect his honor. He took her up on the donkey, he rose up and went to his place, and when he'd come to his house, he took a knife and cut up his concubine and divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces and sent her throughout all the borders of Israel. He wants to rally the 12 tribes to say, we need to revenge this violation of my property by attacking this town.
Just cut this person up in pieces.
Yeah, again, respect bodily autonomy even after death. I mean, this is one of the worst stories you'll find. Between the rape and then the murder.
Let kids read these Bible stories.
This is why it was banned in Utah.
Yeah.
Now I might understand that.
Yeah.
Sex and violence.
Yep. So now they decide to get revenge. And so the gathering, congregation means like the congregated troops, sent 12,000 of the most valiant men there, saying, "Go strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, with the women's and the little one. Here is what you do. You kill every male and every woman who has lain with a man." You can save the little girls, but all the males of any age and all the women who've lain with a man. We've seen this before, right, in the biblical Torah legislation earlier. They found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known man by lying with him, and brought them to the camp to Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. And so they spoke to the children of Benjamin to proclaim peace to them. Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave to Benjamin the woman they had saved alive from the woman of Jabesh Gilead, but there still weren't enough for them. Their concern is providing women to the tribe of Benjamin that has lost its women, so that the tribe of Benjamin can propagate itself. Do they care what these girls think? I mean, these girls have just seen their families wiped out, both of their parents, and any brothers they had, and probably older sisters too, you know, and now they're being handed around as brides to make sure the tribe of Benjamin can propagate children. But we don't have enough women to go around. Benjamin needs women, like Mars needs women. Benjamin needs
What does
women.
he need?
They need more women. So how will we provide wives for them? Oh, here's an idea. The tribe must not be blotted out. That would be terrible. However, we are not allowed to give them wives of our daughters. We've sworn an oath when we were fighting them. Cursed be he who gives a wife to Benjamin. So we're stuck. Ah, says someone. There's a feast of Yahweh, the Hebrew God, from year to year in Shiloh, which is on the north of Bethel, on the east side of the road. Goes from Bethel to Shechem, past the Dunkin' Donuts. You make a left at the detailed directions is really interesting. They commanded the children of Benjamin, go lie in wait in the vineyards, and see if the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances. And then come out in the vineyards, each man catch his wife from the daughters of Shiloh, and then go to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us, we'll say to them, grant them graciously to us, because we didn't take for each man his wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, otherwise you would now be guilty. So
Wait, what?
it didn't happen as the spoils of war,
Right.
so now we made it a kind of random chance event, where the daughters went out, if somebody grabbed one, great, they get to keep it, and that's how they work it out. Again, this is not something that would necessarily work out in real life. They're trying to resolve a narrative problem because Benjamin was attacked and they lost their women, and now they need women because there needs to be a tribe of Benjamin. But again, the narrative of how these women are treated, these daughters of Shiloh who are simply going out for a festival, a dance festival. I mean, you know, the resonance of what's happened just last week in Israel, where all these young people were at a rock concert festival and then were attacked out of nowhere. I mean, this is, you know, straight out of this kind of a story. So they catch a wife as a, not even a war bride, this is like a kidnapped bride from the dance festival, and that's how they repopulate the tribe of Benjamin, because the narrative demands there be a tribe of Benjamin in times to come, therefore they have to solve it, and they solve it with this story of kidnapping wives from another town. It's also not always clear whether the people in Shiloh are Hebrews or not, or the people of Jabesh Gilead, where they took all the girls that had known a man, were they Hebrews or not? They could have been.
Don't you have a problem with the bloodline that supposedly?
But my point is, as I mentioned last time also, the idea of the mother defining who is Jewish is a later innovation in Jewish life, as evidenced by these kind of stories where they can just take women. I mean, this happens elsewhere. One famous example is Joseph, when he's sent down into Egypt as a slave, marries the daughter of an Egyptian priest, which you'd think, how could he possibly do that? But in a patriarchal era, it didn't matter who the woman was. The father would define the tribal and thus the ethnic identity. Now, the rabbis also solved that dilemma with creativity. They imagine that Dinah, you remember Dinah, one of Joseph's sisters, who was raped by the Canaanite prince? Supposedly, according to the rabbis, Dinah gave birth to a daughter. But, of course, the shame of the daughter was she was the product of rape. And so Dinah took an amulet, wrote the Hebrew god's name on it, and put it on the little girl's neck, and then sold her away into slavery, going down into Egypt. When she was there, she was bought by an Egyptian priest who raised this little girl as his own. And when Joseph was in Egypt, he was thinking, who the heck can I possibly marry here? And then he saw this young woman with the amulet with the Hebrew word on it, and he said, this must be my niece. And we know that nieces are allowed to marry uncles, according to Torah legislation. Therefore, it was okay for him to marry. I mean, it's like a soap opera, right? Like, no sex does not result in pregnancy. Every episode of sex produces a child, and there's no loose ends, right? So any baby that's born winds up showing up in Act 3, and then, you know. So that's how they solve that dilemma. That's another example of the patriarchal line defining Jewishness. This is one of those stories. Okay, third one we'll look at is the story of David and Bathsheba. Also not Jewish leadership at its best.
No, it's certainly not.
So at the beginning of the year, the turning of the year, at the time when the kings go out to battle, David sent Joab as general, all of Israel, to attack the children of Ammon and to besiege the city of Rabbah, but David stayed in Jerusalem. And so the beginning of the story is already setting you up that David's doing something wrong. This is the time the kings go out to battle, and what's David doing? Sends out his general, and he sticks around in the city. But of course, where were all the fighting men? They're all out on the field.
So he's got all the women.
So it is a temptation. At evening, David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house, which of course is the tallest building in town. So he gets to look down on everybody else. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. This woman was very beautiful to look at. David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, Uriah the Hittite's wife?" Again, notice, you have a Hittite who could marry a Hebrew. Right? She's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. But they know who she is. It's not a big town, right? Everybody knows everybody. So David sends messengers, and they took her. She came into him, and he lay with her. She was purified from her uncleanness. That might have been why she was taking a bath, because she's, past her menstrual period. And then she returned to her house. She conceived and sent to David and said, "I am with child. I am pregnant." Now, why is this a problem?
Because she's someone else's wife.
She's someone else's wife, and how many suspects are there for who could have caused this pregnancy?
Yeah.
Everybody else is out to war.
Right. Very limited suspect list.
Yeah. Uriah ain't there.
And Uriah's not there, but David is. So David sees the problem. David sends to Joab, his general, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Uriah came with a dispatch from the front. And David said, "Go down, go sleep with your wife, take a bath, take it easy. You've been working hard at the front." He wants Uriah to cover for him. If Uriah goes home and sleeps with Bathsheba, then even if it's off by a month or two, we can fudge it. But Uriah refused to do that. He says in the ... "How can I sleep with my wife when the soldiers are out in the field suffering?" Which, by the way, is an implicit judgment of David, who slept with his wife while the soldiers are out in the field suffering. So Uriah slept at the door of the king's house and didn't go down. When they told David, David said to Uriah, "Didn't you come from a journey? Why don't you go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents. My general Joab and the servants of David are encamped in the open field. Should I go in my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As you live and as my soul lives, I will not do this thing." So he has values, integrity. So David said to Uriah, "Stay here tonight, and tomorrow I'll let you go." So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem that day. When David had called him, he ate and drank, and he made him drunk. At evening he went to lie in his bed with the servants of his Lord, but he didn't go down to his house. So he did sleep in a bed the second night because he was drunk, but he still didn't go down to his house. So David says, "Okay, I need a new solution." He wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In this letter he said, "Send Uriah to the forefront of the hottest battle and then retreat from him so he'll be struck and die." So now he has to eliminate
Solve the
Uriah.
problem because he dies and they won't know that he didn't sleep with his wife.
But then David can marry her, once Uriah's out of the picture, and ex post facto, solve the problem. And so ultimately this happens. They pull back from Uriah. He's killed at the walls of the city. When Uriah's wife heard that she was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when the morning was past, David sent and took her home to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. And the thing that David had done displeased Yahweh.
Don't piss off God.
Yes. So what winds up happening is Nathan the prophet comes to David, tells him he's been doing wrong, that son dies, and as we'll see, David's house gets very much messed up in the chapters to come. But what does Bathsheba think about all this? Well, she's stuck because she couldn't say no to the king, but now she's pregnant and they're going to stone her for whoredom if it isn't resolved. So David resolves it, even if he resolves it through murder. But he certainly feels entitled to take whatever women he wants. And keep in mind, he has lots of wives already. He's married at least 2 of Saul's daughters. He has concubines. I mean, he has plenty of opportunities elsewhere, but he wants Bathsheba. And he takes her, and then other people pay the price.
How long did you have to mourn for your husband?
I don't know. It could have been the 7 days. It could have been the 30 days.
Because that could have screwed up the time schedule.
That's true. That's true. or she had a preemie that was like 8 pounds.
That happens, I've
It
heard
does,
that.
it does. Okay, so just 2 chapters later, the chickens come home to roost. Remember, David has multiple wives, so there's a lot of half-siblings, right? Because they have the same father but different mothers. So Absalom, the son of David, had a beautiful sister, whose name was Tamar. And Amnon, the son of David from another wife, loved her. Amnon was so troubled he became sick because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed hard for Amnon to do anything to her. Now he had a friend who was very subtle. And the friend said, "Why are you so sad?" And Amnon admits, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." So Yonadab said, "Lay down on your bed and pretend to be sick. When your father comes to see you, tell him, 'Let my sister Tamar come and give me bread to eat and prepare food, and I'll eat it from her.'" So Amnon lay down and pretended to be sick. And so he asked for Tamar to come and feed him. David says to Tamar, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and make food for him," and so she does it. He's lying down. She takes the dough and kneads it and makes cakes in his sight and bakes the cakes. She takes the pan and pours them up before him, but he refuses to eat. Amnon said, "Have all the men leave me." Every man went out from the room. Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the room so I can eat from your hand." See the setup here. She took the cakes which she had made and brought them into the room. When she had brought them near to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come, lie with me, my sister." So he's grabbing her. He's clearly forcing himself. There's no ambiguity on this, like we talked about with some of the others. So this is clearly a violation, and her response makes it even more clear. She said to him, "No, no, my brother, do not force me. Such a thing ought not to be done in Israel. Don't do this folly. Where would I carry my shame? And as for you, you will be one of the fools in Israel. Speak to the king. He won't withhold me from you. He'll let you marry me. If you really want to do this, fine. He'll let you marry me, but don't do what you're going to do. Don't force yourself on me in this way." So this is clearly a case of rape, and she says no. His response, he would not listen to her voice. Being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. And then Amnon hated her with exceedingly great hatred. For the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. Once he has what he desired, now he wants nothing to do with it. He says to her, "Arise." So he's not going to pull a David and Bathsheba ex post facto, let's make this real. This isn't even a Shechem story like we read about with Dinah, where he took her and humbled her, but then he loved her and he wanted to marry her, and he even circumcised himself to make it right with her father. No, this is rape, and then he hated her and wanted her gone. And she said to him, "Don't do this, not so. This is a great wrong in sending me away, even worse than the other thing you did to me. Let's at least pretend this is, the beginning of something." He would not listen to her. He called his servant and said, "Put this woman out for me." Doesn't even use her name. Not my sister, not Tamar. And bolt it and lock her out. Exactly. She had a garment of various colors on her. This is the same phrase used for Joseph's coat of many colors. For the king's daughters were virgins dressed in such robes. He bolted the door after her. She put ashes on her head, a sign of mourning, and she tore her garment of various colors that was on her, and put her hand on her head and went her way, crying aloud as she went. Absalom, her brother, said to her, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? Hold your peace, my sister. He's your brother. Don't take this to heart." Does he not care? Well, we'll see. But notice she takes the garment that was a sign of her virginity, and she rips it because she can't wear it anymore. And she's lamenting what's happened to her. She remained desolate in her brother's house, but when King David heard, he was very angry. And Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, but he hated him because of what had happened to his sister. And ultimately, Absalom tricks Amnon to come to a meal and then kills him. And then David has to chase Absalom, and Absalom leads a rebellion against David. He sleeps with David's concubines on top of the roof of his house so everybody can see this.
Wants to sleep with her.
Everybody wants to. And then ultimately Absalom is killed, but David laments because he's his beloved son. And this is that famous line that shows up
In Broadway.
in Broadway plays and in the William Faulkner novel, Absalom, right?
Yeah.
It's David lamenting the loss of his son, who's rebelled against him, who slept with his wives, but he still loves him in some way. And so you see how these sexual improprieties and the woman being used to enact men's conflict with each other or their own lust, but simply not respecting the women themselves, leads to all of this bloodshed and disaster. So the last one we'll look at is the story of Ruth, which is about women operating in a man's world. You'll recall the premise of Ruth is that Ruth is married into Naomi's family, but all the husbands die. And so they make their way back to Bethlehem, where Naomi is from, and Ruth decides to stay with her, even though Ruth is by birth a Moabite. But she's tied her fate to the Jewish people, or the Hebrew people at the time. They get to Bethlehem, they begin working as gleaners, which means they harvest the grain that falls to the ground. The reapers are cutting the stalks and collecting most of the wheat. Whatever wheat happens to fall to the ground, the widows and the orphans, they can collect them. These are two widows who are collecting the gleaning. Now Boaz sees her. Maybe he sees her bent over picking up and is particularly attracted to that angle of her. In any case, he says, whose lady is this? Notice the phrasing there. Whose young lady is this? It's property, right? To whom does she belong? Not who is this? Whose is this? The servant set over the reapers answered, it's the Moabite lady that came back with Naomi from Moab. She said, can I gather with the gleaners? And so she came, and she's worked all day long. Then Boaz said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, don't go glean in another field. Stay close to my maidens. Let your eyes be on the field that they reap and go after them. And I commanded the young men not to touch you. So you'll be safe here. But notice, if he hadn't commanded the young men not to touch her, who knows what hands might have happened. But here he's extended his protection over her, and she'll be safe. And so she's very grateful to this. Why have you favored me? Because I'm a foreigner. And as it turns out, they're related. They're sort of an extended kinsman. And Naomi is thrilled to hear this. Boaz is our kinsman. That's great news. He could not only protect you because he likes you, he could marry you and resolve this problem. He will be winnowing barley tonight on the threshing floor. So wash yourself, anoint yourself, get dressed, and go down to the threshing floor. But don't make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. It will be when he lies down. You will note the place he is lying, because it gets dark and there's lots of men lying everywhere. Keep an eye on which one is his corner. Right.
The wrong guy.
Then you will go in, uncover his feet, and lie down. Now, sometimes the feet or the legs is a euphemism for a little bit further north. You will uncover his feet and lie down, and then he will tell you what to do. So make yourself available. And it may be that things will go the right way, and we will have protection and be regularized. Because we're two widows making a living on the margins, wouldn't it be great to be finally married into a well-off household that has fields and servants and so on? And Ruth says, all that you say I will do. She went down to the threshing floor, did everything. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, we saw that with Achashverosh, right? Heart is merry, means he's drunk. He went to lie down at the end of a heap of grain. She came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. At midnight, so evidently some hours later. Sometime later, right. At midnight, the man was startled and turned himself, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, who are you? Here he says who, not whose. And she says, I am Ruth, your servant. Therefore spread the corner of your garment over your servant, for you are a near kinsman. So she's letting him know, we want your protection and your authority over us, but also you can do this the right way. You can marry me and you'll be connected to us. And he said, you are blessed by Yahweh, my daughter. You've shown more kindness in the end than the beginning, because you didn't follow young men, rich or poor. You chose me, an older man, but a well-established landowner. Don't be afraid. I will do all that you say, for the city of my people knows you are a worthy woman. It's true I'm a near kinsman. However, there is a kinsman who's closer than I. I'm a second cousin 3 times removed, and he's a first cousin 4 times removed, but that's closer. whatever the math is, he's closer. Stay this night, and in the morning, if he will perform for you the part of a kinsman, good. Let him do the kinsman duty. But if he will not do the duty of a kinsman for you, then I will do the duty of a kinsman for you as Yahweh lives. Lie down until the morning. Now, she lay at her feet until the morning, at his feet until the morning, and then she rose up before one could discern another. For he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Bring the mantle with you, and she held it, and he measured out measures of barley, and then he went to the city. So before sunrise, before anybody could see anything, he said, sneak out and go home. Now, this reminds me of the old Hollywood movies where they couldn't show people in bed together, where they would start kissing, and then it would fade out to black, and then it would fade in the morning. What do you think happens between... He says lie down in the morning, and she lay down in the morning, and then got up and left before...
He didn't tell her to go away that night.
He did not say go home now. He did not say let me get a servant with a torch and he'll take you. No. She stayed with him. Is this an Esther Achashverosh story? We don't know. Again, the pious see this as, Lucy and Desi Arnaz in twin single beds, and never the two shall meet. My recollection actually is the first example of a married couple in bed together on TV was on the Brady Bunch in the 1970s. So,
really?
That late.
Wasn't sooner than that?
I don't think so. Not showing a married couple in bed together.
I thought, I can't think of their name.
Maybe there was another show. That was my recollection.
Mary Tyler Moore and Dick, whatever.
Oh, the Dick Van Dyke Show, or
Yeah, it seems to me. I watched that.
I don't know if they showed them in bed together.
They would not.
All right. Well,
I don't have a good memory.
this is a Google question. We can easily solve it. But in any case, in the Ruth story, again, it's a little more blue than we might have imagined, remembering sort of the comic book version of the story. But you'll also notice that they're still dealing with this property issue. The kinsman has a right, and he has to, give up that right and to let Boaz marry her, even if they are a great fit. And maybe they've tested that they're literally a great fit. So the reality is that this is women working in a man's world. And there are lots of other examples. I've only chosen a few. In the prophetic books that are like Isaiah, Jeremiah, they'll often refer to Israel as whoring after other gods. It brings a new meaning to the idea of God as a jealous God. He's literally like a jealous husband who sees you whoring at. Israel's personified as a female there, and she's whoring after other gods, and therefore she deserves whatever punishment comes to her. Then there are other narratives we haven't chosen to look at. The reason why this is important, even for we who are secular, is that the Bible is like a template. It's a starting point for religious communities and how they treat women. In rabbinic law, women are not accepted as witnesses. Only men over age 13 are valid as witnesses in Jewish legal proceedings. When the ring was given to a bride, it was only given from the groom to the bride and not in both directions because it was emblematic of the purchase price. And you're not allowed to acquire a wife on Shabbat. So you can't get married on Saturday daytime until sundown. So there's all kinds of treatment of women issues that come out from these original stories. And unless you're willing to critique those stories, you can't critique the laws that come out of them. And that's why one of the seminal works of Jewish feminist thought, called Standing Again at Sinai by Judith Plasko, dives into this question of not just what the rabbinic law says. What do the stories say? What are the archetypal images? What are the templates for how women should be understood, and how can we challenge those? Maybe we have to stand again. We have to go back to the beginning and start from scratch. You can't just start with the laws at the end. You have to look at the laws at the beginning. We also find a very different approach to this when women read the story. There's a wonderful collection of women's responses to the book of Ruth called Reading Ruth. But it's all women authors writing essays in response to the story. How do they understand the story from their perspectives and their experiences? They see themselves in the narrative in different ways than the men do, and that's why rabbinic commentaries, until modern times, were all by men because only men were rabbis. So that body of literature has a big flaw in it, in that it only provided one gender perspective on these narratives. In the end, it depends on whether you see this as a revealed source that cannot be criticized, divinely inspired and therefore perfect, and the only way you can shift it is by commentaries or apologetics or retelling the stories in new ways. So that shifts the meaning a bit, but you don't tackle the story itself. You could say it was divinely inspired, but the humans were flawed, and so all the flaws are the people that were interpreting things in bad ways. Or you can take our approach, which is it was written by just people. People in a certain time, in a certain place, reflecting their values, and it's literature. So it has its flaws, it has its strong points, and we're allowed to reject parts and celebrate others. And finally, you can take the strategy of retelling the story, but in a positive way, not to add in more naked people, like in the retelling of Esther, but to give people, and specifically women, their dignity. So we'll end the formal presentation part with a poem that's a retelling of the Genesis story, but instead of making Eve the villain who brings death in the world, who violates God's commandment, Eve becomes the hero who brings humanity something very important. So the poem is called Applesauce for Eve by Marge Piercy. Those old daddies cursed you and us in you, damned for your curiosity, for your sin was wanting knowledge, to try, to taste, to take into the body, into the brain, and turn each thing, each sign, each factoid round and round as new flat facets glint and white fractures into colors, and the image breaks into crystal fragments that pierce the nerves while the brain casts the chips into pattern. Each experiment sticks a finger deep in the pie, dares existence, blows a horn in the ear of belief, lets the nasty and difficult brats of real questions into the still air of the desiccated parlor of stasis. What we all know to be true, constant, melts like frost landscapes on a window in a jet of steam. How many last words in how many dead languages would translate into, but what happens if I, and whoops. So she's a hero. She sought knowledge. That's what we want. It undermines what prevents us from growing. We see Adam wagging his tail, good dog, while you and the snake shimmy up the tree. Lab partners in a dance of will and hunger that thirst not of the flesh but of the brain. Men always think women are wanting sex, cot, snake, when it's the world she's after. Then birth trauma for the first conceived kid of the ego. I think, therefore I am. I kick the tree. Who am I? Why am I going to die? You are indeed the mother of invention, the first scientist. Your name means life, finite, dynamic, swimming against the current of time, tasting, testing, eating knowledge like any other nutrient. We are all the children of your bright hunger. We are all the products of that first experiment. For if death was the worm in that apple, the seeds were freedom and the flowering of choice. That's Eve, the hero, who brought us knowledge, who challenged an unjust rule. And we are the children of that hunger. Knowledge is a thirst like the body. And the men, you hear the men reading the story, they read it all wrong. Adam's boring. He's a good dog who just obeys and wags his tail. And okay, so it's a snake. Does that have to be a phallic symbol? Really? That's what you think we're after. She wanted the knowledge. It even says in the original text, she saw that fruit was beautiful and it was good to make one wise. That was why she ate it, because she wanted the knowledge. Now, this does not change what it says in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. But it does shift what you think when you read that story. Because this is how intertextuality works. You write something new, and it shifts the understanding and the context for something old. Even if you can't change the old, it means something different when you write something new. And this is perhaps the most effective way. This is such a wonderful poem, because it takes that old story and makes it a feminist, strong, heroic moment. And that's the kind of reframing we need in dealing with these stories. So with that, I'd like to ask if you have any comments, questions, reactions. Any other thoughts?
I don't think I ever really knew that Ruth story, like what was actually going on in that.
Yeah, they don't actually
Uh,
have you read the Bible anymore.
no, I mean, I just remember it being couched as a tale of loyalty to Naomi,
Yep.
and never any of the other. Oh, and then she married Boaz. Yay, us! You know, everything
And
worked
it
out okay.
actually becomes, I think, either the grandmother or the great grandmother to King David. So she's important in the pedigree line. But yes, the Boaz, seduction part of the story is not always promoted. Susie, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I have several comments. Um, can you hear me?
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
Oh, yeah.
okay, I'm off. Um, so the first thing I'm thinking that I want to mention, when I was in grade school and I was going to conservative congregation Sunday school because my parents were practicing what Dan called pediatric Judaism. It's good for the children. We learned the books of the Mishnah. And one of them, I think, is Seeds. It's about agriculture. One of them is women. And I always wondered, why is there a book about women? And certainly the commentary you've been giving us answers that question. It's because women were a factor in the dominant life of the men in the patriarchy, and there were laws and expectations, just like there were on all the other supports of your life. So that was useful. It was very
Yeah.
interesting, and I appreciate it. Go ahead.
Just to respond to that one, and then you're welcome to have some others. It's the reason why Simone de Beauvoir called her book The Second Sex, or why anatomy textbooks would have the male anatomy as the standard human form, and then the woman was a special section. The laws in the Mishnah and in the Talmud that the Mishnah is based, of which the Mishnah is the basis, describe the male form as, again, the default, the ordinary. And then they have all these special cases that apply to women, whether it's menstrual impurity laws or laws of marriage and divorce fit into the women section. Of course, why would you have to call it women if marriage and divorce applies to both the men and the women? But it's understood as dealing with the circumstances of women in that case, where all the other books apply to all men. The holy things books, Kodashim, that applies to men because men are the priests. Women can't be priests. The agricultural work, the men are the ones owning the land. They're the ones deciding the farm. They're the ones handling inheritance law. So these other cases apply to men. The women is its own separate and subordinate, less relevant case. Now, I will mention one other detail. A lot of people who are active in Jewish LGBTQ inclusion will highlight the fact that rabbinic law does recognize the existence of more than just two genders as phenomena that appear in the world. So they'll refer to people who look like one, start out as one gender, but then when they hit puberty, seem to become something else, or that come out without any particularly identifiable sex organs and then develop later. And so they recognize the phenomenon of human sexual diversity in form and expression, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they accept them as equally legitimate gender options. There's still an A or a B, and then they have to deal with the cases that don't obviously fit into A or B. And how can I make them into either A or B? There really isn't a space for not A or B in rabbinic thought. But the fact that it was recognized as a phenomenon at least is something, but it's not necessarily the triumphant trumpet that some have tried to make it into. You're not going to find progressive thought on gender and transgender issues until modern times. It's just you'll find a few episodic things, but it's very, very hard to make it. And it's certainly not normative in rabbinic law. Susie, do you have other thoughts, reactions?
I have a few other points I just want to make quickly.
Great.
One is the whole idea of the male being the standard and the woman being derivative. We know now, and I think this really does have some scientific authority, that the Y chromosome is a degenerate X chromosome, smaller, and it has much less on it. And I think there have actually been studies. I read that. It's not just a one-liner. The next thing I want to point out is the poem you read us, the Marge Piercy poem.
Yeah.
I've recently reread Lessons in Chemistry, and that the poem is about Elizabeth Zott, the main character in there, who
Oh,
is
cool.
who winds up being on television as a scientist teaching cooking lessons after she leaves her research position. And that's a wonderful book. And then the other thing is I've joined book clubs lately, and another book club has me reading The Book Woman of Troublesome Creek, which is a phenomenal book. I'm not finished with this one yet. It's about somebody in Kentucky around the Depression. It's a lot about poverty. She dispenses library books, but she is what they call a Kentucky blue person. It was an odd genetic thing that died out. These folks were stigmatized as much as blacks. They were restricted on the basis of color, just like blacks, and the sexism that ran that society. It's the Mountain Society in Kentucky. She's always dealing. You get a very graphic scene of her rape on her wedding night, and then her husband dies of a heart attack. So there's some retribution, and then later a distant cousin tries to interfere again, and that's as far as I've gotten. Uh, so join book clubs. You never know what you're going to do. But I recommend that book too. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I mean, the sad reality is that these stories and these episodes are not confined to one culture or one
No,
human experience. It's a universal human experience of gender dynamics often going sour and to the painful, brutal, and traumatic.
it and it's striking to me as I read this how odd and alien it is, especially because the character, the first person narrator, is so matter of fact about it. It's just a condition of life, and I think those of us who are privileged uh, not to have that as a condition of life uh, can use some exposure to that other perspective. So it was
Right.
a very,
Right.
very highly recommended book.
Any other thoughts or comments? All right. Well, there was no way this was going to end on an upbeat note, given the
No, I had a feeling, having read all those stories, I had a feeling where you were going with
given the
that.
topic. Yes,
Yeah.
it was not going to be happy.
I learned every one of those stories in Sunday school with you is very different.
Yes. Well,
I'll
they're
bet
framed.
they were.
Well, look.
Well, they sanitized there. First of all, the fact that Adam has mentioned that certain euphemisms, you're like uncovering his feet means something different. Well, unless you know that, or you're old enough to figure it out.
9 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, the other thing is, to be fair to other traditions, I don't teach our second graders this story either.
Yeah. Well,
You know?
Yeah,
what
I
you
mean,
don't?
certainly hope not.
Right.
You might have a problem with
and we do Purim and we talk about Esther and we don't get into the, read between the lines details with that one either.
We idolize Esther.
We don't do that anymore,
but little girls.
we do,
tend to.
but we do highlight Vashti as a positive figure for pushing back and so on. But we don't get into the weeds on this at an inappropriate age. There is a time for getting the true story. You shouldn't do, like to adults, they should see the real thing. You don't have to sanitize it for them. But when you're teaching kids and you want them to have some cultural literacy to understand some of the narratives, then maybe you do simplify it or soften it a bit. So when we did a Megillah project where we had our students decorate the Megillah scroll, which is really very beautiful. They did a great job. We've done it a couple years running. We made some full scrolls. I took the word virgins and made it young girls. I took the word eunuchs and made it servants. Because I decided that third graders didn't need to know what a eunuch was and why, or to ask that question. And getting into the why virgins, I decided we need an age-appropriate version so we can focus on the full text was there. If they wanted to read it subtly, they could. The one house and the other house is still there for the night with the king, but we decided to soften it a bit just to not raise age inappropriate questions, and so that's okay, I think.
Well, kids I mean, I wouldn't have understood any of that at 9 years old if that, my
Boy,
Sunday school
9 you
teacher
might.
taught like you did.
Well, but
Well,
you,
maybe not,
but-
but you know, I
No.
read it in the Bible, and this didn't strike
But you-
me as anything interesting.
but some kids might be curious about what's a eunuch
Yeah.
Right,
so
oh, yeah.
and what's a virgin? Why does it talk about virgins?
Yeah, I mean, in eunuchs, well, we don't really do that anymore, so, you know, at least not around here.
Well, my mother would have sent me to the dictionary. And I
Yeah,
would have understood the dictionary.
yeah, well, that's how it goes. I think there's a scene in To Kill a Mockingbird where Scout asks Atticus, her father, who's a lawyer, Atticus, what's rape? And he says, it's non-consensual sexual congress with a woman, or something like that. And Scout says, well, shoot, if that's all it is, then.
If that's all it is.
That should be appropriate, that's.
Because he always wants to tell his daughter the truth, but he just uses big words that she doesn't understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we decided that in that case, softening the language was
Yeah, that
acceptable.
seems quite
It
reasonable.
makes sense.
But for you adults, no mercy.
No,
You get the real story.
it's destroyed me totally.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it does highlight that, you know, I mean, this is a cultural artifact, this Bible. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's written over time, and it reflects the kind of values that societies had at the time, not just the Hebrews, but, I mean, levirate marriage is very, you know, very widespread. You know,
That's the marrying the brother's widow.
Yeah.
Your brother dies, you marry her so that you can produce an heir.
And yeah, exactly. And in African societies, it's exactly the same thing. You want to have an heir. So, you know, the child of the wife, even though it's by the brother, is considered the son of the dead brother, you know, and that way the line continues.
It's a nice logic reasoning.
Well, it's logical, and what's even more interesting in some ways is, like, for example, in Nigeria, there were women who became very wealthy as traders, and they married wives, like a rich man would marry wives, and and there was nothing sexual about it. It was a whole economic status thing, and their wives would get pregnant by men, and they would be considered their children. I mean,
That's fascinating.
yeah, I mean, yeah, these things, you know, there's all
Where gender and power become interchangeable.
right.
categories.
Well, it's interesting that when a woman takes on a man's role there,
Yeah.
then she becomes a man
Right,
socially.
yeah, right. Which always reminds me of the line in the story with Elizabeth, you know, she says, I know, Shakespeare in Love, she says, I think I know something of a woman in a man's job.
Oh, yeah. That's a great line.
That is
It's a great
It's a
line.
great movie.
Yeah.
Marriage is often an economic.
Oh, absolutely.
act,
Oh,
not a
absolutely.
romantic act. That's a very modern notion. And, you know, people who were at the top of the social hierarchies married for power and
And wealth and lands
wealth
and
and dynasty, but
political
even
alliance.
people who didn't have so much, it would be an economic unit to have division of labor and children to help with the survival.
And also clan alliances.
Yeah,
and
clan
so-
alliances.
Well, a lot of societies are constructed for groups of two. And single people, that's why single people don't often they have horrible
Status,
times in some of the old, you know, more original societies and stuff because the society's constructed for married families.
Right, exactly. You know, if you look back at historic literature, I mean, people have written about love for a long time, but it's very often tragic. You know, it's Tristan and Isolde, it's Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
You know, the love doesn't turn out so well. It's, you know, it's not the norm, and it's unusual that.
But the courtly love genre in literature, that's not about getting married. It's about knights, and the woman is married to somebody else. And then you have somebody like the wife of Bath, who has property and who had 5 husbands at the church door. And she was gaptooth, which means that she was lecherous.
Right.
See all kinds of odd things.
We can end it with Tevye says, so, do you love me?
Yeah, right. After 25 years, he has to
25
ask,
years.
do you love me? Right. And they suppose they do. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.